How do cute babies turn into monsters? That is, into people who are violent, abusive, sociopathic. If you think about it, all violent people, even the most violent people that have ever existed on earth, were once cute little babies. Even Hitler and Stalin and other mass murderers were once little sweethearts, innocent beings with an open heart and pure, infinite potential. Beings that simply wanted to have their needs met. So how does a baby turn into Hitler or Stalin? How does a baby become what we call a monster or an evil person? Well, the causes of violence are many. And in this video, I would like to share with you the most important ones. The first one is psychological and has to do with emotional trauma. Psychologists who have deeply studied the lives of violent criminals have found out that most, if not all of them, went through tremendous suffering during their lifetime, especially during their very formative years, that is, during their early childhood. They went through so much suffering that it inflicted lifelong wounds in their psyche. Wounds that they are still carrying and from which they have not yet healed and recovered. Violent people were neglected, abused, humiliated, or degraded as children on an ongoing basis. Now, when someone goes through so much suffering, especially during childhood, one develops certain psychological defense mechanisms to deal with the pain that one is going through, to deal with the harsh reality that one is living in. One such defense mechanism is emotional numbness. People who experience tremendous suffering tend to become numb to their own emotions and feelings. And one of the ways that they do that is by suppressing their emotions. For example, by suppressing their sadness or their anger. Imagine a child being abused by its parents. That child will most probably suppress its anger, because otherwise its anger might bring even more abuse to it. Now, although this defense mechanism might help one to cope with the reality that he or she is living in, at the same time, it causes other problems. For example, the emotion of anger that has been repressed might be perverted and turn into rage or hate and eventually into violence. In addition, when one becomes numb to his or her own feelings, one becomes numb to the feelings of others. One stops feeling that much empathy towards other people. One might see other people hurting and not be bothered by it, which makes it more easy for one to be violent toward others. Violent people tend not to feel pain or guilt or remorse when they're abusing others. If one felt empathy towards someone else, one would not be abusive toward them, because one would share in the pain of the other person. And that would be as if one was hurting his or her own self. Now, another cause of violence, and in fact, the biggest psychological cause, which is also the result of trauma, is shame. People who were neglected, abused, humiliated, degraded during their childhood tend to start feeling inadequate. They start feeling unworthy of love, undeserving of compassion. They start feeling small in comparison to others. And then for their entire lives, they are searching for respect, for love, for the attention of others. And if one cannot find these things in non-violent ways, one might resort to violence. Because violence is often a way to command the respect and the attention of others. I was reading stories about violent criminals, and one thing that I came across again and again during my research was that many of them found tremendous gratification just by seeing terror in the eyes of their victims. Because in those moments, they said, they had their victims' full attention. In those moments, they felt a sense of respect toward them. In those moments, they felt powerful and in control, things that they were lacking in their everyday lives. Shame is the primary psychological cause of violence. That's why if you ask most violent people why they committed the violent crime that they did, they will say that it was because they were disrespected by their victims. And through violence, they tried to replace shame with a sense of pride and justice. Now, another cause of violence, and the biggest of all, even bigger than shame. Shame is the biggest psychological cause of violence, but the cause that I'm going to talk about now is social and systemic, and that is socioeconomic inequality. That cause is the biggest because it creates violence in a systemic way and on a mass scale. When you have a population that is divided into different socioeconomic classes, when you have the lower class and the upper class, when you have the poor and the rich, there is bound to be a lot of conflicts and violence in that society. The bigger the socioeconomic inequality there is, the bigger the violence is going to be, at least in most cases. First of all, it is important to understand that poverty itself is a form of violence, because we have the means as a collective to feed and shelter and provide every human being with everything that they need. to grow healthily and to thrive. That's why Gandhi said that poverty is the deadliest form of violence. Some people are forced, due to the systemic pressures of our socioeconomic system, to live in very bad conditions, in conditions that cause chronic stress and suffering, in conditions where some people don't have enough to satisfy their basic needs, in conditions where people don't have access to the resources that they need to live healthily and happily. Conditions that are traumatic, that result in the emotional numbness and shame that we saw earlier. When you have poor people living next to rich people, they are bound to feel ashamed. They are bound to feel that they are victims of injustice. They are bound to feel less than human, especially in a culture that equates self-worth with net worth. It is no wonder that most violent criminals come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Is that a coincidence? Is it maybe because poor people are worse than richer people? Are they inherently evil or something? No. They were just unlucky to be subjected to poverty. So if we want to deal with the violence that exists in this world, we need to understand the conditions that are causing people to become violent, both the psychological and the systemic. But how do we deal with violent people in our culture? By punishing them, by putting them in prison, by dehumanizing them, by calling them monsters or evil. And thus we are recreating the conditions that made them violent in the first place. That's why a lot of violent criminals remain violent or become even more violent once they exit prison. To deal with violent people, we need to stop punishing them. We need to treat them with compassion. And when I say treat them with compassion, I don't mean to excuse or justify their violent behavior. I mean to try to understand its source and address it from its root, instead of just dealing with violence on a symptoms level. We have to dig deep and find its root causes. We need to see that violent people are victims of violence themselves. And we need to try as much as possible to heal them rather than punish them. And if we want to prevent violence on a mass scale, if we want to see people stop being that much violent, then we need to change the structures and the systems and the institutions of our society. We need to create systems wherein everyone has access to what they need to satisfy their needs. We need to create systems where everyone has equal opportunity, that nobody feels lower than others, that no one feels dehumanized, but everyone is seen and respected and taken care of. These are the only conditions that can truly minimize violence.